So I want to say just a couple of things about sort of the state of the field, if you will, of Dogen study, and then what we can do as practitioners in sort of the modern West to approach Dogen's teachings and writings. So some of this has reference to things we talked about in the retreat, but not all of it does. And I think this particular sort of set of information is relevant for all of us, whether or not we were at the entire retreat. So if you were at the retreat, you have your handouts, you can certainly pull them up, follow along a little bit. But if you don't have them, that's all right. I'm just going to say some things. So a few words about the state of the field when it comes to Dogen studies. You know, academic Dogen study, Dogen Kinkyu, started really with a 1924 article called Shamon Dogen, or the Monk Dogen, by a Tokyo professor named Watsuji Tetsuro. And it's kind of from there that the whole thing in modern times starts up. So he said that Dogen should be liberated from the calcified image that was created and maintained by Sotoshu as a denomination. You'll recall during the retreat we spent a lot of time talking about how the image we have of Dogen today was really crafted. There's a lot of branding going on, to put it in modern terms. So this professor says, you know, Dogen doesn't belong to just one sectarian community. Dogen is bigger than Sotoshu, if you will. He says Dogen belongs to the world. So he wants to liberate Dogen from this sort of box that historically he's been put in. So Dogen begins to be studied by both Japanese and Western scholars of history and philosophy and sociology and linguistics and other fields, in addition to Buddhism. So he's even becoming bigger than Buddhism. He's not just bigger than Sotoshu, he's bigger than Buddhism. So he moves from being a sort of a purely sectarian figure as the founder of Soto Zen to having a different kind of cultural relevance. So the Shobogenzo wasn't published until the 19th century. It had been sort of a house document until then. You'll recall it became the house rules. Everything Dogen wrote became the house rules for Eiheiji at one point. So this was a sort of a house document. It was really only known and used and referred to within Soto Zen up to that point. Then English translations of Dogen's work started appearing about 40 years ago. Suddenly he's starting to just inch his way over toward the West. The hope was that some kind of a core of Western researchers with the appropriate language skills, the appropriate cultural understanding would be developed, and then they could build on the research that was going on in Japan. So research was starting in Japan, it's starting to move to the West, and the hope is we're going to build a group of scholars and practitioners perhaps who could pick this up and move it forward in the West. So there's some feeling today that because Dogen studies developed relatively rapidly, there are some key areas that have kind of been left out. So Dogen studies really starts to gather speed, if you will. There is research and debate extensively on a certain few areas, but there are other things that have kind of not really been touched. Large areas of specialized work that haven't really been undertaken yet. So there may or may not be something in America that we can call an organized field of Dogen studies. It's kind of still happening. It's kind of still developing. So when we today want to learn something about Dogen, as we've seen, we've actually encountered several versions of him. Which of the Dogens that we've received are we looking at and paying attention to? So we've got the 13th century Zen teacher who is contextualized within sort of religious tradition, or the history of the Zen tradition. We've got the Soto sectarian patriarch, again, this guy who was created, or whose image was created in 18th and 19th century, in order in large part to legitimize Soto Zen and Soto Shu and what was going on there. We have the philosopher, who was created in the 20th century from the sort of pre-war Japanese encounter with the West, and with Western thought. So he's positioned within this kind of abstract, universal truth kind of scenario. We have the Japanese cultural figure, which was largely created by post-war historiography, positioned within medieval society, within medieval culture, because we've got a guy, again, who's doing calligraphy, he's writing poetry, he comes from the aristocracy, so he has that sort of cultural cachet also. So he's been taken up by a number of different communities for a number of different reasons, with a number of different sort of specialized lenses, if you will. So Watsuji, who wrote that 1924 article, said, You know, it's okay that I'm not a practitioner myself because Dogen wrote his teachings down. Therefore, it was clear that Dogen thought they could be communicated to others through writing. So it's okay if you don't practice because he's written these things down. So anybody can pick them up and read them. So some other Japanese academics started to agree with him. And again, Dogen moves beyond Soto Zen to become this figure that various people argue is more universal, more modern than that really specialized sort of Soto Zen figure. In the 1960s, Dogen's work starts to be included in works of classical Japanese literature. So the image of him shifts toward the literary, the poetry, the writing style, right? He becomes a literary figure. A few books about him are available in America, none written by Americans, all taking a sympathetic sort of view of him as a Zen teacher. By the 70s, there are more and more translations. We see more and more of Dogen's work in English, but Buddhist studies is still mainly a scientific field. It's centered on ancient India. It's centered on investigation of particular Buddhist texts. So, you know, we have that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a Zen tradition, which we here is a living tradition. It's not tied to texts. It's not tied to the practices of ancient India. It's also associated at this point with some popular anti-intellectual fads, right? We're all aware of that kind of intersection. So there's still not so much interest in Dogen studies, right? Buddhist studies is still about classical India, or, you know, practices about something else in the 60s and 70s in the West. So there's still just nothing we can really call Dogen studies. So in the 80s, Dogen moves beyond Zen centers and beyond the fringes of academia to the intellectual community or the philosophical community. And we also begin to see original scholarly work on Dogen by, guess what, young Americans who are being trained up in Western and Japanese philosophy. They're using the lenses of philosophy or the techniques of philosophy to look at the teachings rather than approaching these things as practitioners. So again, we're still very much in the world of the intellect and academia and philosophy. So from an academic standpoint, Dogen is fairly well known in the 90s and the 2000s. The problem is that he's such a big topic and the writing is so difficult that he still doesn't get a lot of attention. Everyone knows who he is, like nobody's willing to take him on. So early Zen studies tend to focus on China. Studies on Japan and other Asian cultures are still kind of catching up. And the earliest Dogen studies we have focused on his ideas rather than on historical or religious context. So today there's much more interdisciplinary approach to Buddhist studies across the humanities, right? So this is where we start to see the sociology, the linguistics, the religious, the history, all of these things kind of coming together. And this is really the approach we took in the Intro Dogen retreat, right? We looked at all of those kinds of context for Dogen and what he was writing. So that interdisciplinary approach is happening to Buddhist studies in general, but there's no question, I think, that the work that Hojo-san is doing on translation and interpretation is critical for those of us who can't read the primary sources. You know, most of us can't pick up Dogen and read him. Not only are we not familiar with Japanese, he's writing in classical Chinese, he's alluding to a lot of things, right? So for us to just pick that up and read it, not really possible. So I think Hojo-san really is sitting in a very important intersection between the classical text as he can read it and practice with it and understand it, and a modern Western language, right, in a modern Western context. You know, there are studies done at Komazawa University. Most of us can't read those either. Those are also done in Japanese. So, you know, most of us don't have the cultural background to read what Dogen is writing and immediately understand it. So there are several ways in which I think what Hojo-san is doing is really critical for us right now for the growth of practice in the West and in this country. So there are some things we can keep in mind as we are undertaking Dogen study, whether we're studying with Hojo-san or we're studying on our own or with another teacher. So Hojo-san, you've heard him, I'm sure, many times, recommends that we look at more than one translation of Dogen's work and perhaps several commentaries on the passage that we're reading. So don't just read Hojo-san. It's a great place to start, but he would be the first to say, we need to look at more than one translation of the thing that we're reading. Translators have to make choices about words and about interpretations. And as we saw during the retreat, there's sometimes more than one way to explain or interpret something, more than one way to translate something. How much do translators explain in footnotes? How literally do they translate? Or are they making something readable? Or are they filling in enough context within the translation that it means something to us as modern Western readers? Translators have various skill levels. They have various specialties. Some of them are clergy, some of them are lay people, some of them are academics. All of those things are valid, but every one of them takes a different perspective, right? So it can be important to read more than one. Get a well-rounded picture, especially of something as nonlinear as what Dogen is describing when he writes, right? He's not taking a linear path. So to have the perspective of more than one kind of translator, more than one point of view is very helpful. I know for me, sometimes I find what I think he's getting at sort of between 2 or 3 translations. It can take those multiple layers to try to get at exactly what Dogen's trying to point us to. So as we've seen, Shobogenzo takes up many koans. Dogen uses them as a gateway to something larger. He doesn't just explain the koan. He doesn't just take the koan apart. He's using that koan as a gateway towards something else. So he's well aware of how these stories are usually understood, and he's doing something else. So often you'll hear Hojo-san say, or you might find a translator say, here's the usual understanding of this story. Here's what usually it's pointing to or what we think it means. And Dogen says, yes, and. There's also this whole other thing. If we really explode the language, there's this whole other thing. So he's doing something different. It's important for us to understand what that new insight is that he's bringing to that koan. So how is he doing something new with it? He's not just taking a text and doing an exegesis. He's using that text to point at something else. So understanding the koan, or the usual understanding of the koan, is helpful, but we can't stop there, right? We've got to go on to what is he adding, what is he pointing? He's not adding anything. What is he pointing out that's there that we're not already seeing? So we probably need to go back and become familiar with that original koan and the usual understanding, and maybe some commentaries or something on it. And then we need to intersect it with what is Dogen saying about it? What is he using it, to uncover? We will likely find several of those linguistic devices that we talked about during the intro Dogen retreat. A negative turned to positive, or a key word or phrase kind of distorted or reinterpreted, or something going on there to make that point in a different way, to say something new. So this is why we need context if we're going to understand what Dogen's talking about. So the point of a lot of it is that it turns conventional teaching of the time kind of on its head. So he's not negating the way we usually understand whatever it is he's referring to, but he's saying there's something else there. Look underneath it, look around it, look behind it. There's something else going on there. It's a response to something, right? It's not just Dogen sort of sitting up in his garret and pontificating. Here's the way I see the world. He's responding to something. He's in dialogue with something. So we kind of have to see that whole conversation. He's maybe refuting a generally accepted interpretation. He might be disagreeing with somebody else's teaching about something, but he's in dialogue with something else that's happening. Either he's in dialogue with the text, or with the teaching, or with a happening, or something. He's not just expressing himself for the point of expressing himself. So we have to understand when he's completely connected to context rather than offering a sort of a universal teaching, right? So we saw a minute ago how Dogen studies kind of makes this shift, or has this tension between Dogen as a figure in historical context and Dogen as a more abstract, universal thinker, teacher, writer, right? So we get to hold both of those things. So for us, it's important to understand what is the context around what he's writing, and at what point is that abstract universal, and at what point is he really deeply responding to something we can point to? And he's often doing both of those at the same time. So we get to hold both of those things. It has consequences for when we try to make him completely modern or completely universal. If we skip that context, or we sort of don't take it into account, we're missing a big piece, and we're likely to have a misinterpretation. So it's not that those responses aren't useful or important, but they might look more or less emphatic, when we remember why they were written, who he's talking to. He can sound sometimes kind of harsh and unequivocal unless we remember he's responding to something. Again, he's not sitting in a cave just sort of ranting about something in his head. He's responding to something. And if we get that context, then we can not overemphasize things we shouldn't overemphasize, or not get stuck in places that we shouldn't get stuck. So this is why we need to know about Japanese history. We need to know about Kamakura Buddhism. Otherwise, it's really never going to occur to us to look for the larger picture. So even when he's writing what seems to be a simple list of instructions, we can distort those things if we take them out of context, if we don't sort of bear in mind, who is he speaking to? Who is he writing to? He's not writing a list of things that he's hoping is going to sort of go into the air and continue to influence people hundreds of years later. He's writing to a specific group, and he's trying to do a specific thing. So if we're reading along and we encounter something that doesn't make sense, I think our human response to that is to try to translate it or reconcile it with something we already know. And if we're doing that with Dogen, we're going to go off the rails because he's trying to point out what we don't already know. So we can't resolve, most of the time, we can't resolve what he's writing about or trying to point out to us by translating it into something we think we already get. And I think this is a habit we have, right? This is our human response. I'm confused, so I'm going to turn this into something I understand. He's often trying to get us to question what we understand. So we can't translate him into something we already get because he's saying, no, there's more you don't get. There's more you haven't seen. That's what I'm pointing to, right? So we're usually pretty uncomfortable with that kind of cognitive dissonance. We're pretty uncomfortable reading a text and going, I don't have any idea what this is about, right? So we want to make a sort of a mad dash to get things lined up and connected, right, and reconciled. We want to connect the dots so we know how to go forward. Like, how do I practice with this text? How do I understand it? How do I keep reading this text? If I can't read this part, does this part make sense? So we really want to make it all make sense. But his point is to pull the rug out from under us. His whole point is to unsettle us and to say, what is it I really understand? And do I really understand that? Do I really get that? You know, he wants to make us unsure of the things that we take for granted. Not because our perception is wrong, but because it's not the whole story, right? He's not negating our day-to-day perception. He's saying yes and, yes and, yes and, right? So we have to investigate. We have to find out what he really means and not just stop at what we think he means. And we so often want to do that. Oh, I think this must be about. Well, maybe. Maybe not. We may think we know what awakening is, or what zazen is, or what a mountain is, right? And we sort of gloss over that in the text. Well, I don't have to think too hard about that because I know what that is. Oh, wait a minute. He's likely to be doing one of these, right? He might be pointing to some new uncommon meaning. He might be doing that with every single word in the sentence. So we're reading along going, oh, okay, I know what a mountain is. Oh, wait a minute. He's pointing to something else. There's my perception of the mountain. There's the reality of the mountain. There's going beyond the difference between my perception and the reality, and we keep peeling that onion, right? So we got to look at like every word. What's he doing here? What's he doing here? So when he seems to be negating something, he might actually, again, be making the point that the thing that he's negating is simply not the whole story. Not that that thing doesn't exist, or not that that perception is wrong, or not that that perception is not important. If he says such and such an activity or such and such a practice isn't necessary, he's not saying never do it. He's not saying it's unwholesome to do. He's saying yes and. Okay, do that, but don't forget to sit zazen. Okay, do that, but don't forget to look underneath whatever it is. So when he says there's no delusion, no awakening, no life and death, he doesn't mean those things aren't real. I mean, we certainly live and die. We certainly have delusion. We wouldn't be practicing if we didn't have some idea that there was something more to see. He's probably saying, if we see those things in only one way, we've missed the mark. If we see life and death in only one way, yes and, right? There's something else there. What else is going on? And sort of the corollary of that, I think, is that if Dogen is silent about something, we shouldn't we shouldn't assume that he's rejected that thing. If he never talks about something, it doesn't mean that he doesn't think it's important or that he's rejected it. Like, he never talks about kinhin, and yet we do it. We don't know what kind of kinhin he did, or if he did it. We kind of think he did. So there were things he took for granted. He didn't talk about every aspect of temple life, every aspect of monastic practice. So especially toward the end of his life, when he's practicing with a fairly small group of monks in a fairly remote temple, he would have been talking probably only about things he particularly wanted to stress. You know, he's coming down to the end of his life. He's trying to leave this legacy. Remember, we talked about the monastic container is the container for his legacy. He says, I've got to build this in order for the teachings to go forward. So if he feels like he's coming down to the end of his life, he's not going to waste time, right? He's going to talk about the stuff that he really wants people to get. The stuff he doesn't talk about doesn't mean he doesn't think it's important, or that we should skip it somehow. He says, you know, this is the group that's going to be carrying on what I have started. This is the group that's going to carry forward the things that I've brought from China, doctrine and practice, right? So he would have been pretty intentional about where he was spending his time. So another pitfall, I think, is taking a sentence or two out of context, and then we want to use those sentences to back up our conclusions, our preconceived conclusions. And we've probably all seen this done, and not just with Dogen, right? We come to a conclusion about the state of the world or the nature of reality or how we think people should be, and then we go looking for a quote and go, oh, but Dogen says, happens fairly frequently. As we've seen, Dogen frequently brings up multiple views of something, and then he leaves it to us, the readers, because we're reading it, not hearing him say it, to work out what he's getting at. So we can't just memorize what he says and parrot it back, because if we pull that out of the rest of the text, sometimes we've lost something, we've lost the other part. Because we know if we look at the way he writes sentences and paragraphs, he'll say something, he'll appear to negate it in the very next phrase, and then in the next paragraph he's doing something different. And if we just take this little piece, we're going to take him out of context. So we run into problems when we take a single sentence out of a text, out of a larger illustration, or one viewpoint out of multiple viewpoints. We just have to be careful. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this passage about from the time you start practicing with a teacher, things like bowing, chanting, offering incense, not at all essential, taken out of context. Mostly to justify somebody's desire to ditch forms, ritual, parts of the practice they don't like or don't feel comfortable with. Oh, well, Dogen said we shouldn't do those.
Point in your future.
Not essential, not don't do them, right? So as we've seen, or as we saw during the intro retreat, Dogen's practice includes prostrations, formal lectures, formal meals, making offerings, a lot of things in addition to zazen, because of course he's way into the entire monastic container. All the rituals, the day-to-day routine as vital to practice. So he was doing more than zazen, just like we do more than zazen. So it's really tempting to take something like that out of context. Oh, well, we don't need to do those pesky ceremonies. We don't need to do that pesky form, right? Dogen said all we should do is sit zazen. Is that what he really said? Let's look under it and make sure. So he's not telling us not to do things. He's just saying, don't forget to do zazen also. Do those things and do zazen too. So, now with context on encountering that passage, we should be asking ourselves, what practice is he seeing around him that he's responding to? If he's saying this and this and this and this are not at all essential, what is he responding to? Let's put him back in context. He's in dialogue with somebody doing something, right? He's seeing these things going on, perhaps to the exclusion of zazen. He's going, wait a minute. You can do all those things, but don't forget to sit zazen. Is he retrained at this point in his career? Is this where he's retraining the other monks that have come to him from other traditions, who've learned other ways? Is he teaching aristocrats who think merit comes from making expensive offerings? What's behind the statement? If we take him out of context, we miss all of that stuff. So we spent the retreat hearing all of that context. Let's not pull him out of that and try to use him to justify something. So we also have to be especially careful about reading I think, modern American assumptions into his writings and into his teachings, and it's easy to make mistakes because we're not aware of our own filters. We don't think we have any filters. So of course it's nearly impossible to know when we're doing this because our assumptions are invisible. We just read things and perceive them and take them in and don't really think about the filters we may have as modern American people. So the more time we spend getting to know that medieval Japanese worldview, that cultural context, what life in the training temple is like, I think the better we'll be able to pick up on where our filters are. Either by spending time in that sort of Japanese temple context, or at least by becoming familiar with it through our own study. I think we're a little better able to say, oh, you know, we wouldn't do it something that way here, but in medieval Japan there would have been this and this and this, so there's a filter. You know, I need to just be careful. So simply being at the retreat or hearing a talk like this, there's your first step, right? You're already on the way. Okay, so some sort of practical stuff we can do. I mentioned, and you have in your handouts, if you have handouts, the Eihei Koroku, Dogen's extensive record, which Hojo-san and Taigen Leighton have translated. It's a big, thick book of Dogen's short talks. In the front of that book are some suggestions about how we might use that text and practice with that text for ourselves. So you may want to just sort of open it at random and pick a short reading and read it and sort of sit with it, think about it, study it. You can enjoy those things out of sequence a bit, although sometimes that sequence is important. So you'll recall when we talked about medieval Japanese lit, Asian lit, in a compendium or in a collection, there is often an arc to that story. Those stories or those talks are arranged in a certain way. Bearing that in mind, it's also possible to open the book and just sort of read one. So I think we have to recall the context in which those talks were given. So students would not have heard more than one talk at a time, more than one talk in a day, right? So it's, you know, you read one, you put the book away. You wouldn't hear 5, 6, 7 talks at a time. So we don't need to we kind of don't need to rush through that text. Take one as though you were hearing it and just sort of investigate it, right? Take time to reflect on it. Sit with it, do the background, do the context, just sort of let it percolate for a while. That's not a book that you open and read page after page after page. Or if you do, you won't get much out of it. Not the way that teaching was intended. So, you know, Dogen isn't trying to do an academic presentation of philosophy. He's trying to encourage practice. So when we read that book, we need to remember, he's speaking to practitioners, and he's trying to encourage practice or to get us to see something about practice. So he's always asking, do you understand? He says something and says, do you understand? Do you really understand? And if you don't, practice with this. Investigate this thing, right? Deeply investigate the teachings, as well as your own immediate experience with your whole body and mind. He is almost always pointing us back to what is your experience of practice? Not go read a book about this. When you encounter this in your life, what's going on for you? And what's your response to that? So let that passage percolate for a while. If you have access to Sangha friends or teachers or people you want to ask about it or talk it over with, of course, that's good. That's fine. Go ahead. Just remember that the teacher's job is not to give you an answer and to tell you what it means. And in some cases, it's not possible. Right? That teacher is going to point you back to your own practice, your own wisdom, your own investigation of whatever is going on there. That teacher can maybe help remove an obstacle or two, or remind you about some context or something, but you're not going to get an answer or the answer, right? Not the teacher's job. So if you have handouts from that original retreat, you have, I think I included this, I think an interesting passage from the front of the translation of Eihei Koroku that Hojo-san and Taigen did, which says, reading one of Dogen's Dharma Hall discourses, in which he comments on a traditional dialogue or koan, the reader would do well to envision the whole scene. First, imagine Dogen sitting up on the seat on the altar in the Dharma Hall, looking down at Jakuen, Senne, Kon, Ejo, Tetsugi Kai, and the other monks standing in the chill mountain air of Eihiji. So they're standing. He's up on the altar and they're standing, listening to him. Then, even before even considering Dogen's often pithy comments, envision the scene in the story Dogen is related. Perhaps it is Jiaozhou, Mazu, Yunmen, or one of the other great masters Dogen frequently cites, face to face with one of those nameless Chinese monks who wandered around questioning these masters and eliciting great dharma. See the situation in the story as a theatrical performance. See it from every viewpoint you can imagine. What is going on for the monk? What is the concern of the teacher? How is it for any bystanders who may have been present, mentioned or unmentioned in the original story? What is the issue or concern? What is at stake? If there seems to be a winner or loser, or praise or criticism, check that this is not ironic. These stories should not always be taken at face value. Only after such considerations, check what Dogen is doing to turn the story. How do his comments change the meanings as you had seen it? What part of the story is Dogen emphasizing to his monks? Is he simply commending the teaching of the ancient master in question, as is often the case, or is he transforming the original story to make some deeper point? Deeply considering these nuggets from Dogen, feel these questions not only with your conceptual thinking, but physically with upright, attentive posture. Allow the situation in the text and your own questioning to penetrate your recent experience, including your breathing and all of your senses. With this awareness, you may bring the teachings of his extensive record to bear in your own life. This was surely his intention. So isn't that an interesting way to approach these texts? Imagine Dogen up on the altar or on his seat, speaking to his monks. What's going on for people, right? What's he trying to do? What are the monks trying to do? What if you're a lay bystander that happens to be there? Because there were lay people there sometimes. Like, imagine that whole scene. Like, oh, there's a whole lot going on there. It's not just, oh, I'm reading a paragraph in a book, right? Envision the whole thing. I think that's a very helpful introduction, or a very helpful reminder. Read them like a theatrical performance. Isn't that interesting? Because we consider theater to be kind of put on, right? If Dogen is doing a theatrical performance, and again, we've talked about embodying, some of the gestures that he would do. If he's making a theatrical performance, like, what's he doing? How can he do that and still be authentic is the interesting question, right? So we can consider what theatrical means. Okay, the last thing people usually ask for, and I meant to bring the clock and I didn't. What time is it?
It is about 12:02.
Okay, good, thank you. So the last thing people usually ask for is a reading list, because we are good students in the West and we want to know, what should I read? If you've looked at our FAQ on the website, there's actually a question that says, I can't make sense of the Shobogenzo, what should I do? And it's right under the question. It says, I'm new to Soto Zen, what should I read? Because these are the questions we get, right? Doju probably gets a lot of this because he reads the programs, the email box. So, which translation of the Shobogenzo should I be reading? Which commentaries, which articles? So I'm not going to give you a reading list. I'm sorry. These days you can easily look up anywhere what's been written about Dogen. You will have enough material to last you for years and years and years. But I'll give you a few pieces of advice that I've learned, and if it's helpful, you can take these in or not. I tend to start with the newer publications and work backwards, whether that's books or articles. I tend to start with the newer stuff. Scholarship is updating all the time. Scholarship is progressing all the time. Some things have become obsolete. Even some classics, things that were considered classics for years, are generally now considered, well-meaning but obsolete because we've learned new stuff. So things that were classic when I was starting out, well, there's newer scholarship. We've seen how, during the retreat, we saw how some questionable stories and questionable assumptions, partly based on branding, have found their way even into solid academic work. These are things that were just assumed to be true for years and years, and then something comes along and questions it or disproves it, right? Somebody unearths an undiscovered copy of a text, and somehow everything gets changed, everything pivots. Oh, this wasn't really written by so-and-so, or oh, this was really written by so-and-so, or the date is not what we thought. And somehow then there's a whole cascade effect and things start to change. So I start to read newer and then work back. In addition to the books, as I say, there are plenty of journal articles that are worth your time. Some of these later become books. Some of them start out as articles and become dissertations and become books, or just are writings that become expanded. So you can sometimes see the author sort of working out his or her argument in a condensed form, which can be kind of helpful, even if you go read the book later on. I think it's sometimes useful. Look at the early kind of thought process about the point that author, that academic was trying to make. So if you don't have access to something like JSTOR, you can get a free account if you don't have it through your school or your workplace or something. Run a search on Dogen or on Soto Zen and see what pops up for you and see what looks interesting, or what might have credibility for you, actually. And then, as I say, work backwards from today. You can also figure out who's writing about stuff you care about, or who's writing in a way which feels accessible to you. Who's doing work on a specialty that you think is particularly interesting and is worth following. You can keep track of what they're doing. Some of them are writing books, some are writing articles, some are emerging, some have been around a long time. So for me, with regard to Dogen, outside of Hojo-san, the big four are Bielefeld, Bodiford, Falkenhayn. Bielefeld, Bodiford, Falkenhayn. Those are, for me, the big four. You may find others that you like. You might look at Shinshu Roberts' book on being time, which is fairly new. She comes at it from the perspective of also being a Dharma teacher, as does Taigen Leighton, with his translations and his works on Dogen, Dogen and the Lotus Sutra, and he's got several things out. So, it's useful to have that perspective of people who practice and who teach practice, in addition to being solid academics, right? So look around for who you like, who's explaining these things in a way that makes sense to you and helps you in your practice. As for translations, well, when I'm talking about the 108 gates or doing some other things, Hojo-san hasn't translated the 108 gates. If I'm looking at a Shobogenzo fascicle, I start with him, which just, if for no other reason, then this is our Dharma family. In addition to, of course, what he says is very helpful, but for the sake of consistency within this Dharma family, if nothing else, of course, I start with him. The challenge there is that his translations are largely unpublished. You can't just go to your bookshelf and get most of them. They're not necessarily collected all in one place, but there are two places you can go for what is available. One, of course, is the Dogen Institute website, which publishes or has available some of his things. And within DI is a link to the list of Hojo-san's articles for Dharma I, which is Soto Shu's journal. And he's, over the years, done translations and commentaries of several Shobogenzo fascicles. So you can go there to get some of his work. Where there is no available Hojo-san translation, then I usually use Nishijima and Cross. There's a 4-volume translation of the Shobogenzo. But again, Hojo-san is the first to say, read more than one. So I might start there, but I might look at others. So with any translation, you're a bit at the mercy of the translator's habits on worldview and education and background and all of those things. Particularly if I'm stumped by some passage I'm looking at, then it's helpful to see what somebody else did with it. If you can decide, you can decide if one version or another makes more sense to you or elucidates the passage in some way. Now that you have background and context and you kind of know what you're looking at, you have some way to make a decision, I think, right? It feels a little less random, I hope. Sometimes I look at a translation, I just think, there's a big piece of context that this person didn't take into account. I don't think that's what that meant, because it feels like not too long ago, I talked about one of the 108 gates made reference to another story which said something about 9 times 9 makes 82. And there was more than one translation where I found that corrected to 9 times 9 equals 81. I went, you missed the point. What's underneath that, right? Which is really interesting because somehow that got missed and it was more than one. So, more than one translation, folks, and bring all of your context to bear, because you might go, I don't think so. That's a modern Western interpretation of something, and I think that's not what Dogen meant. Not wrong, just yes and. Okay. So if you get to know how a particular translator works, that can be helpful as well, because the translator may always translate the same term in the same way, and you can point back and go, oh, that's Bouchot. or oh, that's something. And that's the way he or she always translates it, because if you're not reading the Japanese, you can miss that piece. So it can be helpful to get to know one or two translators like fairly well. Reading different translators mean you might not recognize the same word translated differently and might not make that connection, right? So, you might go, oh, well, this one translates this kanji as abandonment, this one translates it as awakening. Oh, I see the connection. It's just helpful to know that. So comparing translations side by side can be important in that way. So overall, when you sit down to read Dogen, ask yourself some things. What are the circumstances of Dogen's giving this teaching? Who are his listeners? Where are they? Where is he speaking to them? Is this an informal talk? Is he writing a letter to a layperson? Is he giving a formal something in the temple? What's he doing? What might he be responding to in his environment outside the temple? What might his students in front of him need in that moment? Do they misunderstand something? Do they not know how to do something? Is he asking for something new or initiating something new? Like what do his listeners need? And if it's something going on outside the temple, is it history? Is it development of Buddhism? Is somebody teaching something he disagrees with? What's he responding to? What's he in dialogue with? What are the important elements to consider in this particular passage, which might, again, be every single word, if he's turning every single word on its head? So, like, what do we pay attention to? What are the major themes? We talked about themes at the end of that retreat. So, oh, there's that theme again. Oh, there's that word again. Oh, that story. Okay. What traditional teachings is he talking about? What traditional stories is he citing or alluding to or bringing in? And how does he change the common understanding of that story or that passage or whatever it is that he's quoting? Because chances are he's not just quoting it to illustrate something or to back up his conclusion like we do to him. He's putting it in there so he can turn it on its head and say, yes, and something else, right? Yes, this is true, and something else. So what literary devices is he using? How do they add to the meaning? How do they change the meaning? How do they uncover the meaning? So it's a little hard to tell sometimes in translation, but sometimes we can see it. If he's using the same word repeatedly, or he's attaching that word to other words in a particular pattern, it's like, what's he doing with the language? That one's a little harder to see, but maybe. Because that's one of the ways that he's exploding that story or exploding that language. We got to remember, to him, language is not linear. So his language is going off in every possible direction, as you saw from the little exercise that I did with you, where I took Hojo-san's sentence and blew it up. Finally, not to forget, how is what he's saying relating to my own practice life? How is this not just an intellectual exercise? How is this not just mental gymnastics? We can appreciate the poetry, we can appreciate the language, but he's always pointing us back to what's going on in your practice. What's your experience of this moment? What's your experience of this reality? What are you doing in the world? He's always pointing us back to what's that thing we're not quite seeing, right? How are we really embodying Dharma? So if we watch out for those pitfalls, particularly when we're stuck, particularly when we're anxious to resolve our uncertainty, resolve our confusion about what is he actually saying, we want to just sort of get it and move on to the next thing. Want to read that next page of the Eihei Kodoku or whatever it is, like, let's be careful. Let's take our time with it, right? So we got to have patience with ourselves. And we got to have patience with the practice. So the only way this stuff starts to make sense is with immersion, right? And immersion takes time. So it's immersion in Dogen and Dogen's world and his themes and what he's doing and all of how he writes. And it's also immersion in practice, immersion in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, right? We need immersion in both of these things. That stuff takes time. That's the water wearing away the stone, right? So this is not like, well, I've been sitting for a week and now I'm going to like take up Dogen. It takes time. And we all know, I'm sure we've all had the experience, you read something that he wrote and you come back to it in a year or 2 or 20, and you go, oh, there's this thing, right? Hojo-san has even said that, sitting here. At first I didn't get this, and then, oh, maybe it's like this, right? I remember with the Fukanza Zengi, when I first started practicing the Sangha I was in, we used to chant it every night during Sesshin. At the last thing of the night, about 5 minutes before the ending bell, the lights would come up and we'd have to read it because nobody had it memorized then, right? reading Fukanzazengi. And for several years, I was so caught up in the mechanics of reading the Fukanzazengi, I had no idea what it meant. Nothing was sticking. I was just, oh, this is the next form we do as we read this thing, and then we go to sleep. And then I'd done it enough that I realized one day I didn't have to pick up the book. I had it here. And I just started chanting it. And as soon as I did, I went, oh, those first 3 sentences are Dogen's great doubt. If we all, Buddha nature's here, why are we, oh, and just like, as I chanted this, oh, that's that thing. Oh, that's that thing. Because I was done with the mechanics of having to like read it and get the words out, right? It took immersion to do that. So I think the more we immerse ourselves in practice, because that was Sesshin, right? The more we immerse ourselves in practice as well as the text and the context and all that, things start to make sense. Dogen wasn't writing in order to be obscure. He was doing everything he knew how to do to point to something that was not easy to point to. So we kind of have to meet him halfway, right? He's not writing word puzzles for us to figure out. He's just expressing what he saw in a way that was supposed to point us toward practice, right? So that kind of immersion is really important. Once we get a foothold, somehow, things start to fall into place. I think we can be surprised by what starts to make sense. It's not completely impenetrable. I think we do need handrails. I think we do need guides and pointers, but it's not impossible. So I hope those are a few helpful ideas or helpful approaches. Whether you are planning to come to Genzo-e, or you are reading and studying on your own, or you're studying with other people or other teachers, some things to bear in mind. All right. What questions have you got? What things would you like to say? Dogen study and all the joys of Dogen study, and somebody may have to help if there are people at home who have questions. Anything from anybody?
Yeah, Joan, come off of mute. She can't see. Just come off mute and talk. There you go.
Thanks, Wasatsu. You're our virtual manager. All right, somebody's got something to say?
I have a question.
Okay.
I was privileged to hear Shinshu Roberts talking about Dogen and so forth, and she was talking about being time, and she said that, and I may not have gotten this quite right, but she said, I understood her to say that in the Heart Sutra, the whole thing about being is emptiness and emptiness is a form is emptiness and emptiness is form, that Dogen is actually going further than that or something. And I'm struggling to understand that, because I thought that emptiness, she said it was like compassion or something like that. And I thought that emptiness was actually like Buddha nature. So can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, boy, that's confusing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not surprised there's a question, because that's confusing. So I think we can say compassion is included in emptiness because there's sort of nothing outside of emptiness. So in that way, that's right. But compassion is not the whole story, right? So if we think about emptiness as nothing having a fixed permanent self nature, right? Which means everything's changing, nothing's fixed, everything's moving. There's nothing we can grab onto. So form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Dogen goes beyond that by saying in several places, those two things are completely interpenetrated. So in our sort of day-to-day experience and our need to communicate, we call something emptiness and we call something form, and those two things seem to be distinct. He says, that's fine, yes, and. They each include the other one. So if we say emptiness, form is already there. If we say form, emptiness is already there. So we don't actually need to say form and emptiness. If we say either one, we've included all of it. So he's again asking us to go beyond the distinction between emptiness and form. So yes, there's emptiness, yes, there's form, and there's going beyond that distinction. And we continue to peel that onion because we keep wanting to divide things up. So I don't know the particular context in which Shinshu was talking about compassion related to that, so I can't like answer directly about that. But you're right when you say, when Dogen is talking about form and emptiness, he's also talking about something larger. He's saying also there's no distinction to be made between form and emptiness. That's the Reader's Digest version. Do you want to follow up on any of that?
No, that's very helpful. And that was sort of what I was understanding. And so that was actually what confused me.
It is possible to understand, I promise. And you know, that's a form, of course, that Dogen does repeatedly. He will set up a distinction, and then he will say that distinction doesn't exist. And then he will say, we also need to go beyond our idea that there is a distinction and that there isn't a distinction. Right? So he's always saying, whatever you're dividing up, whatever you're hanging on to, whatever you think, there's more. So this is like a lifelong transformative practice. Like whatever we think, there's something else. So it's one of his favorite sort of structures. There's this, there's A, there's B, there's going beyond A and B. He does it all the time with good and bad, and delusion and awakening and emptiness and form, and right. That's one of those patterns that once you start to see it in his work, oh, there's that thing again. Oh, that's where he's pointing to, right? What else would people like to say? Sagan, please.
Yeah, sort of following up on what you just said. What we find very often in Dogen's writings is that, well, at least in the translations, are these hyphenated notions like practice hyphen realization, or for example, delusion and awakening. So
Life,
often,
death.
What's that?
Life, death.
Life, death. I mean, I think
Right.
that's, you know, in translation we have to use a hyphen
Yeah.
to kind of indicate that kind of.
But that's helpful because it connects those two things. So we have a distinction, we have life and death, but then we have this hyphenated thing that says these things aren't actually separate, right? And we can go beyond even, and because now we're talking about language, we can even explode that term so that it goes in all directions, right? We're just constantly expanding, right, and peeling that.
Another example I believe is impermanence hyphen Buddha nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then we get into the whole thing which Hojo-san has talked about here about the difference between permanence and eternity. You know, permanence being fixed, unchanging, you know, and then there's eternity, which is something exists, but it's not fixed. It's changing. It exists, but it exists in different ways. So we can keep like backing up and keep backing up. I think that's what Dogen is encouraging us to do when he's encouraging us to practice and encouraging us to investigate something. It's like, okay, don't stop with what you think you know. Do the next thing. Do the next thing, right? I feel like he's doing that in a bit of a playful way. He's not doing that like harshly, you know. He might be making fun of us, but he's doing it in a way to like poke us to go just that little bit further. What would others like to say, here or at home?
I would, can I, just based on what you just said, you know, it's funny because I see sometimes in various talks that I've been to and you know, people I've spoken to, people often get really frustrated with Dogen, which always surprises me because what you just alluded to is this, you know, it's really a great practice of joyful mind to get like totally confused and totally buried and totally knocked down, and to know that that's the fun, actually. It's the joy, right? Because it's hard, you know, that then, you know, over 10, 15 years when something maybe, you know, a light bulb goes on, it's so much more beautiful, you know? So I just wanted to mention that it's just a good, studying Dogen, that aspect of our study is a really rich opportunity for practicing, you know, joyful mind, you know, one of the three minds. So
Yeah,
at least
absolutely.
I found that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We say, oh, Dogen is really hard. Why? Because we've decided it needs to make intellectual sense. Why is it hard? It's because we have an idea about what our response to it is supposed to be. Well, what if we don't have that? Then we have joyful mind, right? So we've decided we're going to get something out of it. And if we don't get something out of it, well, then this becomes difficult. This is so much like Zazen, right? We sit down, we let go of it. And joyful mind, right? So I kind of think it's the same, we can take kind of the same approach, right? You know, becoming confused, letting go of our preconceptions and our habituated thinking. I mean, all of that is what we do in Zazen. So this is why, by the way, Zazen and study are interpenetrated. I think in some ways we're using the same muscle, if you will, right? We're letting go of this need to be in control of understanding or what we think or whatever that is. can we approach Dogen the same way, right? Can we drop the habituated thinking? If we do, we see something else. If we think we have to, quote unquote, understand it, then yes, it's hard. So I think as soon as we say, oh, this is too hard, then we get to look at, I mean, in an odd way, that's Dogen pointing us back again and saying, okay, what do you think you understand? Let go of that too. That's what makes it, quote unquote, difficult, right? So I thank you, Carla, for reminding us that if we come at this with joyful mind, I think it's probably more useful, if we want to use a utilitarian term like useful. Mark, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of coming off of it, sometimes one of the barriers to Dogen that I've heard other people really talk about is that, a lot of bodhisattvas will take precepts not to boast about themselves or diminish the reputation of others. And if you look at a lot of Dogen's writings, he doesn't hold punches. Like sometimes he is very much dissing people quite clearly. And so is that like, and so is there sometimes a little bit of incongruity there in terms of our own practice and some of the ways that Dogen presents his own ideas?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we can say, oh, it's Dogen, therefore it's skillful means, just like we say, well, Buddha never died, it was skillful means. Well, and the guy was human. There are certainly schools of thought that say the older he got and the sicker he got, the crankier he got. He got out to Eheji all by himself with his little group of monks, and he started getting cranky. And you can see the tone kind of shift over the, So yeah, I think that's one of the other reasons why context is useful. What was his circumstance when he was writing this thing? He was starting a temple with a few people. He was having a tough time. He couldn't get patronage or whatever his situation was. We'd all get cranky, right? So again, we have to be careful about wanting to really centralize things that he appears to be emphasizing. Why is he emphasizing that? Is he responding to something? And in some cases, it might really be skillful, means he's being very emphatic with some of the monks that are coming to him from other traditions because he thinks he has to sort of unteach them some things. He says, that approach is not my approach. My approach is this one. Well, if you're deeply ingrained in a particular practice, you probably need a little help prying that loose, right? So I think that's why context is helpful there. But there's no question, people were doing stuff he didn't agree with, and he had something to say. He had something to say. Others? Doju, please. Okay.
Okay, so I have a blasphemous opinion.
Yay!
About Dogen.
Good.
I think that he was an elitist. And the fact that this intro Dogen thing, I think, really bears that out, that, we need this many lectures just to sort of start with Dogen. And, I think it's an interesting contrast with Shakyamuni Buddha, who seemed to be at pains to make things as clear as possible, and that was, he very explicitly said that, we should always teach in the vernacular, we're not going to do Sanskrit, and his teachings never use these really, highfalutin metaphors and images and so forth. And I think this relates to a problem that we have now, which is that Soto Zen in North America tends to have a difficult time attracting non-middle class people. I think everyone in this room has a university degree. Many of us have advanced degrees. So what do we say to people who are just like, I'm never going to get Dogen, I don't care about this stuff, but I still want to do Zazen?
Yeah.
What do we do with that group?
Boy, what a useful thing to bring up. Certainly when you look at the monks that Dogen was teaching, they also, chances are, were fairly highly educated, had background to understand what he was talking about. So that's really true. And I think it's a very interesting comparison with Shakyamuni, who was very intentionally not doing that. Now, of course, over the course of time, things have been interpreted, things have been shaped in particular ways. There's text, we don't know if this was a real text or not. Okay, there's all of that. But can we sit Zazen without understanding Dogen? Sure. And I think there are plenty of practitioners who do, and they're not interested either because they think it's difficult or because they think it's Japanese or they think it's not relevant, or they're just interested in what we might call a spiritual technology called Zazen until we really understand what Zazen is. Then we know that's not what it is, right? So I think it's entirely possible to understand, to begin to understand what Dogen was teaching, but not necessarily to have to read it the way he wrote it. I think if we're in a Sangha embodying the Dharma and practicing together, we are learning what Dogen was teaching. We're just learning it with the body without going through all of this rigmarole, right? So it's there for people who want it, but I mean, Zen existed before and around Dogen. I mean, what we today call Dogen Zen is only one form of Zen. So, we can certainly say, well, Zazen is what Zazen is, and it kind of doesn't matter what we say about it, or what we think about it, or who we think invented it, or where it came from, or all that stuff, right? If you come to a getting started session with one of these two guys, they're going to teach you to sit Zazen, and you may never mention Dogen. And amen, because somebody can still sit Zazen and completely wholeheartedly experience this one unified reality. So I think Dogen is pointing out some interesting aspects of this one unified reality, but I don't think he has the monopoly, because how can he possibly, right? I mean, what is outside of Buddha's way? What is outside of this one unified reality? So he's pointing us towards some stuff. He has some useful, helpful gateways if they resonate with you. If that's not your cup of tea, I think it's enough to know that there's a guy, in our lineage that we consider to be perhaps the founder of this tradition, but do you have to read all these things? Not necessarily. I think there's other ways to get it. Right? Because as we saw in the beginning of this talk, there are people who say, oh, well, Dogen, he's abstract and universal. We can liberate him from the Soto Shu context. Okay. You can also liberate Zazen from the Soto Shu context, right? One of the important things about Sanshin style, if you will, is that I think it was Uchiyama Roshi, who said, we can sit Zazen, and Zazen is colorless and tasteless and transparent. So you can sit Zazen in any number of contexts. It's important for us to know that we sit Zazen within a particular Buddhist context. That's part of the style of Sanshin, right? But it's entirely possible to liberate Zazen from all of that, and people do. So I think this is a set of gateways. We can take them on or not. And I think it is entirely possible to welcome anybody into a Sangha and not be elitist about that. And I think you're raising an important point. Some of us shy away from this because, well, I can't read Japanese. Okay. I think this isn't the only game in town. So I will join you in a bit of blasphemy there and just say, in our particular Dharma family, we put some energy around learning something about Dogen. I don't think it's the only way. Sanshin style is one way. I don't think it's the only way. You wanted to jump in?
I was just going to add what you're talking about right now. I spent almost 17 years practicing with Myoyu. Dogen seldom came up. Mm-hmm. But we did pretty rigorous koan practice. Mm. And I think about how much that practice works towards stop making sense or stop being rational. Because life is not rational, your engagement is not rational. So it was that kind of enforcement that's always stuck with me. And until I started, intense practice here, I didn't think about Dogen a whole lot.
Yeah, I gotta say that's my story too. When you start sitting, somebody usually wants to tell you about the koans Zengi, or some kind of text about Zazen, because Zazen has been centralized for us, right? So somebody wants to usually talk about koans Zengi. Somebody probably usually wants to talk about Genjo Koan. But maybe those are the only two things you ever learn about. There's plenty of fairly obscure Shobo Genzo fascicles that you don't hear much about. Please.
Ask something else.
Add something else.
It's more about the mechanics of Dogen's language. Mm. And I read, Nagarjuna, I've actually been through I can't say the title of the book, the Maha...
Yes, there you go.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have a scholar in the room.
And there's the way that he constructs, the way that he'll state something, deny it, state something, state it another way, deny it, is exactly the same way that Dogen does it. So my question is, was Dogen getting that kind of construction from Nagarjuna, or that kind of philosophy?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, look at the circumstances in which he was coming up. I mean, he starts out in a Tendai institution, which has inherited the things that Tendai inherited. So that tetralemma that you're talking about, sure, he knew, he'd heard about all that stuff. So, in a way, a lot of what he's saying isn't necessarily original to him, but the way he sees it, the way he understands it, the way he's trying to describe it might be original to him. So if you go back, ahead of him, yeah, you'll pick up those influences and you can understand those things. I think if you're looking at him specifically, it's kind of important to know there are things that break off that he doesn't agree with. So you just got to know if you're reading him that this or that he doesn't agree with. But sure, I mean, he's not coming up with this stuff in a vacuum. He's growing up in a hotbed of new sects and a lot of conversation about practice and doctrine, and all of these things are floating around. So you bet he's influenced by all of that stuff. He may not quote it directly, but certainly when it comes to the Chinese, I mean, when he's quoting Chinese texts, he's leaving it in the original Chinese. His reference books were Chinese. So yeah, he's certainly inheriting a lot of that stuff. Absolutely. I think you're not wrong.
There's a question online from Arnold.
Oh, please, go ahead.
Oh, hi. So I want to credit Doju for bringing up that point originally, because I think that's really, really important, and I know others have been concerned about that. But I came to Buddhism as a result of being in the military, and it's a long story, but at any rate, neither of my parents graduated from high school at the time that I began to practice. I had not entered college yet at that time. It wasn't even really a realistic option in my life circumstances. So I definitely had an inside view of that. Practiced in a really reputable place, and I definitely felt sort of out of place in a lot of ways. A lot of the questions I was asked and everything. So, but the point I want to make is we also have to be very careful not to underestimate people that come from underprivileged backgrounds. There are many highly intelligent and highly inquisitive people that come from underprivileged backgrounds who, when supported in an environment like this to examine texts and things like that, have every capacity to do so. So I think we also have to be very, very careful about the assumptions we make when we're talking about that type of inclusion and class consciousness. We're all not so radically different from one another, and we need to be sensitive to that. And I think we could equally say there are probably some very affluent and highly successful people that are just super pragmatic in their thinking that Dogen would not appeal to. Mm-hmm. So again, I would just caution that. And I originally had a question I did want to ask. And it's going to sound like I've just had a terrible experience with Buddhism or whatever, but because of the first statement. But I was involved with another very prominent Zen center that had really, really scandalous activities, ravaged the Sangha. It's all been very well publicized over a long time. It was a very painful process. And I remember I began to practice really on my own for a long time. And I was really enamored of Dogen when I read I think there's a logic there, there's an evocativeness and all of that. One thing I found very disturbing about Dogen, though, is Fukan Zazengi. He talks about, he really privileges monastics, and I think probably because he's speaking to a monastic audience who is living under hardship, more than likely. But he makes this statement about the precepts of and I'm going to bastardize this. I read it so long ago now. But basically, a monk who doesn't keep the precepts is way better than a lay person who follows every precept or honors their precepts. And I was just curious if you had any insight into that. It's a totally conditional and intending to inspire the monks. Was it his crankiness? Did he in fact possibly really believe that and not believe that the upholding the precepts was imperative?
Well, we talked about that some during the retreat. Yeah. There is certainly, it appears that there is a shift in his emphasis over the course of his life. Because in the beginning of his teaching career, he says all beings is certainly awakening is there for all beings. You can be a woman, a lay person, it doesn't matter. And then toward the end of his life, where he's really trying to focus on the monastic container as the means by which the teachings that he's, brought from China are going to go forward, he is really focused on the importance of that. And part of that is, I think part of that is crankiness. Part of that is that's where his focus is. He certainly, I think the piece that you're thinking of is in the Zuimonki, and Doju might correct me if I'm wrong, where he says even a monk who breaks precepts is a better practitioner or whatever than a layperson, because he's encouraging that kind of monastic
You're right.
discipline.
That is where I read it. That's right.
It's the Zuimonki, yeah.
Thank
So we read that as a largely lay sangha, and we find that pretty discouraging and pretty disturbing, and we just think, I don't like this guy. He thinks you have to ordain in order to be worth anything. So I think we have to be a bit careful. And again, I think that's where knowing some context is helpful. He's trying very hard at the end of his life to establish a very particular and a very rigorous monastic container. In that moment, he's not talking to lay people. But he certainly had lay people participating with him there. He had lay patronage. He was teaching lay people. Toward the end of his life, the one time he leaves Eiheiji is to go spend 6 months teaching lay people and giving precepts. So, I mean, he's involved with the laity, and my guess is he wouldn't be doing that if he didn't find some merit in that. And I don't mean merit in the Buddhist sense. I just mean if he wasn't finding that to be meaningful for himself and for other people. So I think we read those things and we go, yikes. But I don't think we should take that as discouragement for our practice. I think that's another case where we need to know what was he trying to do and who was he talking to. Precepts were certainly really important to him. There was the other piece of context there was that there were a number of different opinions about what it meant to take precepts. There were some that said all you have to do is take precepts and you are saved, and others who said you need to take precepts and then carry them out, right? So again, he's in dialogue with all of these different kinds of opinions that are floating around. So when we read things like that in the Zuimonki, or here in the mornings after practice, we always read one section of the Zuimonki, and we hear about things like slapping monks and beating monks, and we hear that stuff and we go, ugh, this isn't a practice I want to be a part of. Sometimes I'll say to the folks in the morning, let's take that with some, take it with a grain of salt. When you come in the door here, nobody's going to beat you or slap you with a slipper or any of that stuff. He's trying to point us towards something. Let's take the message there for what it means for us, recognizing there's, several centuries and several cultures in between. Let's take what's useful out of that and let go of the parts that maybe aren't so helpful, as long as we understand the context. So we're not ignoring things that are making us uncomfortable. That's not helpful. We're trying to put that into context so we get what was he trying to do. Is that helpful, and do you want to follow up there?
No, that is helpful. Yeah, and I was less concerned. I mean, I guess the distinction of monastics and the elitism, and that was a part of it. But I think I was more interested in the precepts part and the ethical implications of that. But it's interesting because it was helpful what you said before, and I've been trying to think of the context, as we're talking. And I do wonder if there's a compassionate part of that that's possible, which was maybe some of those monastics were struggling with upholding the precepts, and he wanted to sort of say, it's okay, you're doing this other important thing, you know what I mean, in a way as well. And maybe that's a more positive interpretation. Not that it can't still be problematic, but no, thank you.
Not at all. Well, we certainly need to pay attention to where our own perceptions and where our own interpretations are coming in. And they're just things we're never going to know. I mean, he lived so long ago, they're just some things we're never going to know, right? So I also appreciated your first point about having preconceptions about any Sangha member coming in the door. I think the only thing I'll add there is I think we need to recognize that we all need on-ramps into certain things. It doesn't matter where we come from. If we're coming to Dogen, we need some on-ramps. If we're coming to Sesshin, we need some on-ramps. We can all do the practice. There's nobody that can't practice. We just need to figure out how to help people practice in the most meaningful possible way. And for that, we recognize that we sometimes set up barriers unknowingly, set up barriers to diverse communities, and part of our practice is to just discern where those are and see what we can do about that. So every time inclusion comes up, it's a useful gateway for us to think about something related to that. Other things this morning?
I had one sort of just follow-up to
Please.
that. So yeah, just to clarify too about my point, like I was thinking back to my own like high school English class, you know, which was very much not a very diverse place. You know, everyone was kind of from a similar background as me, but there were definitely some people who just did not care about literature at all and were never going to engage with it and didn't care, but were skilled in other ways. And there were people who really naturally just picked up on it and got it easily. So I think Dogen really selects for people who are probably good English students, is my feeling. But the second thing related to kind of thinking about Dogen in a modern context and forgetting the fact that he lived in the 13th century related to this point is, and you sort of touched on it, but I think that Dogen would not have been immune to the idea that becoming a monk had good merit and good benefit for future rebirth. So, you know, I think we tend to think of Dogen as this completely rational modernist who didn't have any, you know, quote unquote superstitious ideas. But I think it's really important to consider that he may have had ideas like that.
Of course. So yes, I think that's, again, you know, we need to understand the context in which he's doing his things, and then we need to take from that what's useful for us today, and just know that that's we need to do it carefully, right? We need to see clearly, we need to do it carefully, because it's easy for us to want to interpret him based on what we want or what we think, and to say, oh, no, he's a universal abstract kind of guy, when, you know, I think you're absolutely right. He was a product of his time, and probably had some pretty strong ideas about the merit one gains from leaving home. He certainly wrote how many fascicles about leaving home and making these and wearing these, right? It was clearly important for him. There's no question there. So I think we just have to be careful not to discourage ourselves in our practice, recognizing that he could never have envisioned this, right? Lay people coming together every day or every week to, you know, sit zazen and to be a community. And I mean, that would have been maybe a strange concept. So he wasn't writing for this. And yet that's not to say that what he said wasn't helpful and meaningful. We just need to do some discernment around it. So I appreciate you jumping back in. Good. Okay. Anything else this morning before we move on to announcements, world peace? We have lots going on today. Anything else today? Everyone good? All right. Thanks for indulging me and allowing me to finish this retreat 2 weeks after the retreat actually finished. I hope those points were helpful for everybody. Yes, I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin. We'll do our closing chant, and we will move on with the rest of today. So thanks for a very good discussion, and good luck with your Dogen study.